Good afternoon, everybody. So, I have some good news and some bad news. Good news is, if you're only paying half attention today, you should know a bit more about ransomware as you leave. Bad news is I'm talking more about ransomware. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap with some of the presentations that came on earlier. Some of that bad news is, as speakers, we don't really know who else is going to be presenting what or to what level of content they're going to go to. So you will see some laps. I've, like any good pre-sales engineer, tried to adjust on the fly. So there'll be perhaps some more technical and hopefully some more tactical approaches that you can take away from this presentation. But further ado, let's dig into it. So when we talk about setting the scene, and again, I'm not going to go way back in time, but certainly if we think about the revolution or evolution of ransomware over the last few years, and when I say last few years, I'm really talking sort of 2015 through to 2019, with a real peak kind of around the 2017 timeline, certainly driven by groups like Lockheed, etc. But that evolution really is driven by this kind of automated send and receive. It was kind of hit and miss depending on the impact of who was a recipient of that message, how well they could protect themselves against it, how well they could recover should they get infected. And that really kind of set the scene for that initial evolution of ransomware. When we look at that today, and we back that up by some of the proof points, if I'm working, there we go. Threat metadata is, as I say, kind of since 2017, this is really where we saw this kind of first stage message delivery. And to really clarify the point, when I talk first stage delivery, this is, I receive a Word document, it has a macro, I enable the macro, I hit ransomware. That evolution really now has shifted to actually what we receive now is some kind of initial access, again, as part of this kind of breakup and delineation and speciality of the different players within that ransomware sort of cycle. And that really can evolve to sort of up to 12 parties we've seen who can have really specific roles within initial access, privilege escalation, destruction within the environment to ensure that the payload is successful, right through then to the ransomware deployment itself. But I guess if we also look into, this is where I've adapted a little bit from the conversation earlier, where we talk about how the threat actors are looking to, understand a bit more about who they're going after and how they're going to be successful. Obviously, in 2020, we really saw a shift as people went to work from home, and as blue teams, we needed to move from probably a more device-focused defense posture to more of a people-centric approach in terms of how we would look to defend our teams and our organizations. The bad news, though, is unfortunately the bad guys were kind of already there. We've seen them quite regularly and frequently look to open source platforms, social media being a key one of those, to really understand, who are the people they're going after within an organization and what's the most likely message that's going to resonate when they send potentially a spear phishing email into those individuals. Obviously, as part of that, they're looking for it to blend into normal business as usual type messaging. And so in that, they're really looking to that people-centric focus when they're looking to shift ransomware payloads. So I'm going to talk through an example here. This is a real-world example. The organization is not necessarily important, although if you've been following ransomware news through the numbers, you may be able to tell exactly who it is I'm talking to. But this was a UK fashion retailer at the beginning of this year who unfortunately suffered a ransomware incident. As we kind of flow through this, and I'll speed this up because a little bit was covered earlier, but in this example, we had a phishing email that had a Word document through to it, went through a number of people in the organization. Some of those individuals received the message and unfortunately enabled macros. Macros, we still see today, is the number one way that, certainly when we deal with attachment-based attacks, the bad guys are looking to get that first stage payload onto the machines. Now, it's not unfortunately as black and white as you will certainly tell me to say, let's disable macros. Let's not allow macros to be used in the estate. But of course, we know that a number of business processes can be aligned to those macros, and they can be very hard to unpick. So yes, we need to operate in that environment. The good news is, and this is just a quick shout out to something that came out last week. So Anton Ovruski does an amazing talk on YouTube as part of the SANS team, and he even shares some free, sysmon configs that you can go and access to be able to baseline macros within your estate, and then start to understand which are being used for nefarious processes, and which are actually potentially just, working with trusted file shares as an example. So just quick shout out for that. But anyway, back to our story. So macros enabled, and in this example, Basiloader was the initial payload of choice that went down to those machines. What we see is these loaders, Basiloader, GULoader, ZLoader, are this new multiple flexible delivery method that the bad guys are using for this initial access stage. What that means is that they can understand a good bit about the environment and then understand what's the next best step that they can do. But also when they come to sell on this access potentially, they can really have an informed sales book to say, this is the organization, this is the type of software they're running, and this is what you're going to be up against when you start to get into the environment. I'll just pause here 1 second. One thing we quite often hear from customers is they say, Alistair, we're worried about ransomware. Our CISO, our management teams, they're asking us, how are we defending against ransomware? How are we doing? And they look in the console, be that a Proofpoint or another vendor, and actually when they look at their email, then they're not seeing ransomware detections. And the reason for this is this shift exactly. So what they're seeing is if you looked and pivot those reports to loaders, to cred stealers, and to banking Trojans, actually what we see 9 times out of 10 is that those are the type of first infections on email that would subsequently lead to ransomware. So again, if you're doing those sorts of reports, you're trying to answer those questions, look for those type of payloads. So, Loader goes onto the machine. As I mentioned, it does a number of bits of harvesting information from the estate. Again, operating system, software installed, what Wi-Fi networks am I connected to, SSIDs, etc. Anything that's really going to tell me what's the organization I'm on, and then what's the propensity, hard to say at this time of the afternoon, for them to pay. So gather that information, shift it back out to the bad guys. The actor at this point, if they're an initial access broker, is then going to package that up and sell it onto the highest bidder. One thing we do unfortunately see here is that quite often that can be sold to multiple bidders. So actually, again, we then see that next stage and is accelerated, as you'll see in this story, because potentially if that's been sold on multiple times, it really is then a race for the ransomware as a service groups to get in, launch their payload, and be the ones to claim victory, so to speak. So in this example, Cobalt Strike is going to be pushed down. Again, it's been talked about earlier, but for those, in case you aren't aware, Cobalt Strike is a commercially available tool, quite often used by red teamers and simulations, but unfortunately is now being used against us. One thing I would say on Cobalt Strike is it's very flexible. It's able to do a lot of things for a lot of reasons. But quite often in some of these attacks, we actually see it being used in default modes. So again, depending on what type of EDR or detection tools you've got, if you tune those to focus on the default configurations for Cobalt Strike, you can have quite high fidelity detections based on that kind of setup. So in here, once it's landed, it's looking to move laterally. Obviously, we're trying to find accounts of privilege within the domain. Once they've found, in this example, the server admin, taking those credentials, either dumping them, keyloggers, etc., escalating that privilege to be able to pivot more. Once that machine and that credential is then owned, again, moving throughout the estate much wider. Again, though, a big shift that we've seen is really how do they block the recovery methods that you would typically use to get out from ransomware. In this example, looking at backup servers, removing snapshots. We've seen advertisers on dark web looking for, for instance, Veeam backup specialists because they want to understand exactly how they're going to disrupt that part of the organization in order to maximize the effects. Gather as much confidential information as they can, what they believe they can then sell on. In this example, it was about 200 gigs worth of data that was shipped externally. Again, you've heard DNS, FTP are your key things to look at there. We've worryingly seen a few shifts towards more G Suite, Office 365, if they're understanding that they're a G Suite house or whatever. Again, trying to hide that traffic in plain sight. But then once that data's been exfiltrated, it's then, what's the ransomware payload? In this example, it was Conti. Conti, I'm sure, is probably, again, well known in this room. But again, it's been a tool that's been updated a few times, unfortunately to, really trigger the performance in here. So it's a highly multi-threaded approach that can be used to do things like off-box encryption tools for those data stores. So this then comes down the wire. We get our typical kind of ransomware notice. Although interesting point, whilst this is just a straight notepad, we've seen some sort of weird blurring between pop culture and ransomware notice. Any Rick and Morty fans in here might know what I'm talking about there. Ransomware payload comes down and then, they're triggered to have that conversation. This is actually a transcript that was subsequently leaked via Computer Weekly after the incident. To save you reading it all, I'll summarize, but essentially, again, it gives an insight into how they're taking these types of approaches. The initial ransomware that was requested was $8 million. Now, this happened during COVID, like I say, to a retail organization. So their initial response was, we're a retail outfit. Due to COVID, we're only getting about 25% of our typical income. So trying to negotiate that payment down. And again, this is where then the data exfiltration part comes into play, because the bad guys basically said, give us a minute, we'll go through your data. They went through the data, came back and said, look, actually, when we look at your cyber insurance documents, we can see you've got £7.5 million coverage. Better talk to your cyber insurers. So this then carried on, and eventually, unfortunately, the organization paid, it actually turned out to be about $2 million to get data back. But again, to echo the message that we heard earlier, just because you pay, these are still bad guys. So there was a big disruption to this organization, virtual machines, a number of impacts that bad guys claimed to have nothing to do with, still put the business into a bad position for quite some time. But again, one thing we've seen that shift is this initial access, data exfiltration, to then the Conti ransomware being deployed was 7 days. And again, that time frame we've since sped up over this evolution. Not all bad news, and some interesting things again for you blue teamers. Again, you may have seen this in the summer. So there's some interesting arguments that happened between the Conti gangs that actually led to one of the internal affiliates leaking a number of attributes online. This included tools that they were using, as well as the playbooks, and very interestingly, a Cobalt Strike user manual, which again, if you're interested, you can find some great red teaming pull-aparts on YouTube that walk you through this and give you some really great artifacts in terms of how they're playing it. But this is covering everything from, initial access through to how you're going to find the confidential data within the organization, disabling of certain endpoint technologies, and then exfiltration of data. So again, gives you a really good visibility into how they're approaching it. I won't hammer this point, but again, we talked about double extortion earlier today. Again, double and triple extortion, unfortunately, is something we've seen. So again, to summarize that approach, where if you're not going to pay to unencrypt your data, then actually we'll look to data leakage, hosting their own sites, where again, maybe they're initially drip feeding some initial kind of files to show that we mean business. Unfortunately, even naming individuals into some of those drip feeds to try and again, trigger an emotive response. Again, my takeaway from this has been talked about earlier, is really define that plan, define your response without the emotion of this going on in the background. Unfortunately, I have been involved in some incident response to some of these scenarios. And again, it's, at that time, you need a very clear and decisive plan that doesn't have emotion tied into it. So yeah, really to summarize, again, this kind of cottage industries turned up, where again, just because you're targeted by a particular threat actor, the numbers that Proofpoint track on the left here, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be hit by a certain strain of malware, or even a certain strain of ransomware because of that. Quite often what we find is that someone upstream has just found a particular good access point and is then selling it onto the same GAN time and time again, kind of having a trusted relationship, so to speak. If we look at some Proofpoint data around this, firstly, sort of file types and patterns, probably no surprises to you in terms of the file types. Again, as I talked to earlier, those kind of Office documents, macro enabled, still very much a weapon of choice for the bad guys. Any guesses as to what the red lines might focus on? I'll give you the first one. So time of day. Again, we very much see this kind of, initial launch of attacks on the East Coast, targeting Asia Pacific, and then following the sun out through to the West Coast of America as it goes. And that second one, any guesses? Weekends. Yeah, bad guys take the weekends. Quite often Friday as well. 3-day weeks. I wouldn't say they're lazy, but certainly again, the thing we're seeing here is really they are trying to again blend into business noise, right? So again, if I'm trying to go about my business, I'm typically receiving invoices because I'm in finance, as an easy example. If I make sure that my malware is going in at that time, and we're really reducing the time from sending to the time from that end user receiving and hopefully interacting from their perspective, then that's going to be all the more effective for the bad guys. Probably no surprises. Malicious Urls really continue to dominate the landscape. The numbers that you see here in the dark blue bars are the URLs. Light blues, much lower down, are then the use of attachments. Again, still prevalent, but very much URL specific. Again, what you'll probably already know, but it's bang for their buck. It's much easier, it's much quicker to spin off and generate unique URLs necessarily than it is to do the unique attachments. If we look at some of these examples that we've taken recently and some different trends that we've seen, job applications, probably nothing new there, but the encrypted part of this is something, again, that we've seen popping up more and more. So in here, you can actually, if you can't make that out, but it's actually the passwords included in the email. Again, just trying to lure people to open, and then lo and behold, looking to trigger the macros. Social engineering to weaponize staff. So being able to offer them a piece of the pie. You know, in this example, we'll give you 1 million bitcoins if you actually just run our malware, or if you open an RDP connection that we can utilize to drop the ransomware into the organization. Obviously, this was, you know, something that was highlighted as part of a Tesla breach where they were trying to bribe an insider, but again, seems to be a continuing trend. This was an interesting one for us because it kind of took away some of the typical playbooks that we see from the ransomware teams. This was a fake movie site that was stood up, Bravo Movies. And again, in terms of what we typically see, it's the least amount of interaction the end user has to do from when they receive the mail to when they trigger the payload. But this actually was quite a convoluted step. Essentially, what you would get was a message to say that you'd signed up to Bravo Movies, you got our free trial, but your free trial's now expired. We're now going to start charging your card for the subscription. Of course, there's then contacts that you can call should this be a malicious thing and you didn't create it. And even a very helpful website that you can go to, looking quite professional in nature, even having some fake movies that they created along with reviews and other things to boot. The way that this played out was essentially you go to the frequently asked questions, you'd find a hotline number, you'd ring the hotline number, endure some very interesting jazz music, and then on from that you get through to an operator who, again, very professional, would ask for the subscription ID number you received in the email. That, again, is unique to the recipient. In order to try and sort of prove some validity, what they would do is then take that subscription number and then play back to the individual, oh, yes, this is your email address, this is your name, this is your information. Now, some of that information may be false, just, again, to try and show that it was it wasn't a genuine subscription. But then what they would do is they would take them onto a website where on that website, again, they'd be asked for the subscription ID. They would enter it, often staying on the phone with the hotline, and then download an Excel file. This Excel file is, was kind of positioned to be, we need your cancellation number, so you need to run it. Obviously enabling macros again as they do that. At which point, again, then the machine is going to start getting that payload. This was another example of the same thing. I won't comment on music taste, but again, unique reference numbers coming out. The message here really is that, again, that they're playing to things that are happening in the news. This was obviously as Justin Bieber, I believe, was doing a concert, but at the same time, around Valentine's Day, we see flowers and chocolates. Again, much more, again, trying to fit in with the sorts of things happening in society. And again, of course, we're concerned for your security, so here's that phone number to contact. Now, this is where hopefully, again, as a vendor, I don't want to push FUD, but again, I want to break the numbers down for you. This is some very interesting data from Coveware. Coveware is an organization that we partner with. They do some really good ransomware quarterly reports that you can access and get very interesting data with online. And as part of that, they've looked at the attack vectors and spread that back over a number of years. Hopefully, the colors come through, but the primary one there, as you again heard earlier, RDP. Brute forcing RDP is the easiest way that they will get into your network if you have that on the edge. If you haven't got that from today, please take that away. And then the next after that, again, email is still the number one threat vector. So this is where we see email being the next target because unfortunately people will still click links, they'll still open attachments, and they'll still enable those macros. Last but not least though, and this is definitely still being used, is patching and vulnerabilities on those edge devices. Again, a shout out to something that was popped up on my Twitter feed recently. Thanks and credit to Alan Lisker for this. But this is looking at the CVEs that are being used in the wild by the ransomware teams based off of the type of edge device that you've got. Some great intelligence out there in the community that you can use to, again, just prioritize that response and make sure that, again, it's not patch everything, but it's prioritized and it's in that approach. Now, I am an email nerd, so I'm afraid it would be remiss of me not to talk a little bit more on email, sad as that is. But, again, be this Proofpoint, be this any other vendor, I want to talk to, I think, the evolution of defense in depth just within email itself. An email gateway, yes, has multi-layers and multi-other things, and hopefully you have a strong one backed by good intelligence to remove the majority of that content. But nonetheless, I think sandboxing, again, should hopefully be a table stake alongside that, certainly from an attachment perspective. But again, looking to that to URLs, being able to follow those through to final payloads is also key. Definitely not to be missed is the security and end user awareness. Again, helping people not to click those links, to understand the attachments, to really understand what the bad guys are looking to do, just by a few clicks of their mouse. Not only to try and remove and stop them from doing that, but also to notify, right? So back to that response piece, if they can be your first line of defense, to be able to spot something, highlight it to you, and then use an automated response to then go into your 365 or other mail platform and remove any artifacts that contain the same information is also key. Last and definitely not least, isolation, I think, has come on a long way as a technology and a capability. The end user experience is, to most unrecognizable in terms of the differences. But again, in terms of that post-delivery and weaponizing of content once it's already in the user's inbox, isolation is a great way to remove that. To shift the payload, detonation and everything happens within the isolation chamber, completely away from the end user's machine. And again, depending on when that gets weaponized, that persistent link has been rewritten to remove all of that content. Hopefully, I think I've finished actually a little bit early, because I'm definitely between you and beer. So with that, I'd like to say thanks very much for having us here at IRSCon today. And I've got a couple of minutes, so if there's any questions, happy to take those. If not, we'll go for a beer. Thanks very much.